The snow had been falling since 4 that morning, and by the time Maren Holloway flipped the deadbolt on the shop and stepped out into the parking lot, the whole of Spadina Avenue in Sault Ste. Marie had gone the color of wet newspaper. She was 52 years old, and for the better part of 2 years she had been telling herself that things would turn around in the spring. They had not turned around in the spring. They had not turned around in the fall either. And now here was another winter, pressing its cold thumb against the windows of a furniture shop. Her father had run for 31 years, and that she had been quietly bleeding to death since she took it over. She did not have the rent for January. She knew this the way you know the weather is about to change, somewhere in the joints, before the sky does anything at all. The shop was called Holloway and Daughter, which had been her father's idea of a joke and his idea of a promise, both at the same time. Reginald Holloway had painted those words on the front window himself in 1986, back when a man could make a living refinishing other people's heirlooms and selling the pieces nobody wanted anymore. He had taught Maren how to read a dovetail joint the way other fathers taught their kids to read a hockey play. By the time she was 9, she could tell oak from ash by the smell of the sawdust. By the time she was 50, she could tell, just by running her palm across a tabletop, whether the thing in front of her was worth saving or whether it was only worth the firewood. What she could not do, it turned out, was keep the lights on. The numbers were not complicated, and the narrator will lay them out plainly, because the rest of this depends on understanding exactly how thin the ice was. Maren owed 3 months of back rent, which came to $4,200. She owed the heating company $1,100. Her daughter, Priya, adopted at 4, now 19 and in her 2nd year of nursing at Sault College, had a tuition balance of just under $3,000 and that the student loan had not covered, and Priya did not know about it yet, because Maren had been intercepting the letters. There was, in the business account, $416. There was, in Maren's own checking account, considerably less than that. People in town had opinions about her. That is the thing about a small city that pretends to be a small town. Everyone is a shareholder in your failure. The polite version, the one they said at the Tim Hortons on Great Northern Road, was that Maren Holloway had never quite had her father's head for business, God rest him. The less polite version, which traveled just as far, was that she'd run a good shop into the ground out of pride, refusing to sell it when the developer came around 2 summers back, waving a check that would have cleared every debt she had, and left enough for a condo besides. She had refused. She had her reasons. Some of them she could explain and some of them she could not, and the one she could never quite say out loud was that selling shop felt like turning her father off, like pulling a plug, and she was not ready to be a person who had done that. The narrator notes, for the record, that roughly 1 in 5 small businesses in Canada fails within its first year, and that nearly half do not survive past their 5th. Holloway and Daughter was in its 40th. By the cold arithmetic of these things, it should have been gone a long time ago. That it wasn't says something about Maren that the rest of this story will get around to proving. The man came in on a Tuesday, 3 days before Christmas, stamping snow off a pair of expensive boots that had clearly never been meant for snow. He was perhaps 70, narrow and upright, with a silver mustache trimmed to a severity that suggested he did it himself with a ruler. He wore a camel coat that probably cost more than Maren's truck. He did not say hello. He looked around the shop, at the bookcases and the dressers and the long farmhouse table she'd been trying to move since October, with the expression of a man counting exits. "You buy estates," he said. It wasn't a question. "I do," Maren said. "Pieces, sometimes whole rooms, if there's anything worth the trip." "My sister died," the man said, in the flat way that grief sometimes wears when it has gotten tired of being grief. In Wawa, I'm her executor. There's a house full of furniture and I want it gone before the new year. I don't want the trouble of an auction, and I don't want strangers walking through her rooms. You come, you take what you want, you write me one check, and we're finished. His name was Desmond Achterberg. He gave it the way some men give a password. Reluctantly, as though it cost him something. Marin wrote it on the back of an invoice. Wawa was a 2-hour drive north, and the roads in late December were not a thing a sensible person took lightly. But 200 kilometers was nothing against the possibility of an entire house worth of furniture she could buy cheap and sell through the winter. She told him she'd come the day after Boxing Day. Cash on collection, Desmond Achterberg said. I'll have a price in mind. If it's fair, you'll pay it. If it isn't, you won't, and you'll drive home. He looked at her then properly for the first time. You're Reg Holloway's girl. I'm his daughter, yeah. He sold my father a desk in 1990. Roll top. Bird's eye maple. He said it the way some people recite scripture. Still in the family. And then, before she could decide whether that was a kindness or just a fact, he was gone, the bell over the door swinging in the cold draft he left behind. The house in Wawa was the kind of place that had been grand in 1962, and had been quietly losing the argument with time ever since. Marin brought her cousin's son, a 22-year-old named Cody, who had a strong back and a willingness to work for $40 and lunch, and the two of them spent the better part of a frozen afternoon carrying the bones of another woman's life out into the snow. Most of it was junk. The narrator will not pretend otherwise. Most estate furniture is junk, particle board and veneer, and the accumulated weight of a life that didn't think much about what it sat on. But there were 3 pieces that made the drive worth it: a cherry sideboard, a set of pressback chairs, and, in a back bedroom that smelled of mothballs and old paper, a steamer trunk. It was the trunk that did it. Marin knew the second she saw it. Domed lid, oak slats, brass corners gone the dark green of long neglect, the kind of trunk that crossed the Atlantic in a ship's hold 100 years ago, and had been used to store winter blankets ever since. The label inside the lid, half torn, read Goyard, and Marin had been in this trade long enough to feel her pulse change at the sight of it. Desmond Achterberg wanted $400 for the lot, the whole lot. He had named a price as promised, and the price was the price of a man who wanted his sister's things out of his sight and did not particularly care what they were worth. Marin paid him in 10s and 20s, counted out on the kitchen counter, and she did not say what the trunk alone might bring, because that is not how the trade works, and because she suspected he already knew and simply did not care. It was 9 o'clock that night, back in the shop with the heat cranked and the snow ticking against the front window, that Marin found the false bottom. She wasn't looking for it. She was cleaning the trunk, working saddle soap into the old leather straps, when her knuckle knocked against the base and the sound came back wrong, hollow. She knew that sound the way she knew the smell of oak. She got her father's flat pry bar, the one with his initials filed into the handle, and she worked the edge of the base up, gently, the way you'd lift a scab you weren't sure was ready. And underneath the false panel, wrapped in oilcloth, gone brittle with age, was money. A great deal of money. The narrator will tell you exactly, because Marin counted it twice, and the number mattered. There were 41 bundles of bills, banded in paper bands gone soft and yellow, and they were not the bills currently in your wallet. They were old. Some were the big bills Canada printed before 1973, when the notes were larger than they are now. There were red $2 bills and green $1 bills and a fat band of brown hundreds with a young Queen Elizabeth on them. And tucked among them in a separate oilcloth packet were 12 gold coins. Sovereigns, she'd learn later. British, dated between 1911 and 1925. She sat on the floor of her father's shop with the money in her lap, and she did not move for a long time. It is worth slowing down here, because this is the hinge the whole thing turns on, and the narrator does not want you to miss what was actually at stake. Maren did not know that first night what the money was worth, but she knew it was a lot. She knew the old large format bills had value beyond their face. Collectors paid multiples for them, and she knew gold was gold. Sitting on that floor, doing the kind of math a desperate person does, she arrived at a number that was somewhere north of $50,000, and possibly a great deal more, and against that number she set the other numbers, the ones the narrator gave you earlier. $4,200 in back rent, $1,100 to the gas company, $3,000 for Priya's tuition, the letters of which were at that moment sitting in a drawer in the kitchen, unopened, where her daughter would not find them. And here is the thing that made it a real test and not just a parable. No one would ever know. Desmond Achterberg had sold her the trunk. He had said, on the kitchen counter in Wawa, "You take what you want." There was a receipt. The trunk was hers, lawfully and completely, and whatever was in it was hers by the plainest reading of the transaction. His sister was dead. He had not opened the trunk. That much was obvious from the dust. He did not know the money existed. By every standard the law would recognize, Maren Holloway had bought a steamer trunk for $400, and it had happened to contain a small fortune, and that was, as they say, the luck of the trade. People in the antiques business told stories like this around the fire. The Picasso behind the thrift store print. The first edition in the box lot. It was the dream. It was the thing that kept people pawing through other people's discarded lives in the first place. She could keep it. She could keep it and clear every debt and put Priya through nursing school and never tell a living soul. And the only person who would ever know that Maren Holloway had found $50,000 and kept it would be Maren Holloway. Which it turned out was the whole problem. She put the money back in the oilcloth. She put the oilcloth back in the trunk. She drove home through the snow, and she did not sleep. For 4 days she told no one. The narrator wishes to be honest about this, because a story that pretends the right thing is easy is a story that insults the reader. Maren did not decide cleanly. She decided the way real people decide, which is to say she decided 8 or 9 times in both directions and changed her mind in the night. She thought about her father. This was the part she kept coming back to. Reginald Holloway had a saying he used so often that Maren had stopped hearing it as a child and only started hearing it again now, at 52, on the bad nights. He used to say that the trade only worked because of what you did when no one was watching. A refinisher could hide a crack with wood filler and a coat of stain, and the customer would never know until the piece split a year later in a dry house. An honest one didn't. Her father had once driven 60 kilometers to refund a man $80 because he'd discovered, after the sale, that a solid cherry dresser had a veneered top. The man hadn't noticed. The man would never have noticed. Reg Holloway had noticed, and that was the whole of it. The narrator notes that there is a body of research on what psychologists call the lost wallet experiment. Studies in which wallets containing money are deliberately lost in public to see how many are returned. The largest of these, published in 2019 and run across 40 countries, found something that surprised even the researchers. People returned wallets more often when they contained more money, not less. The conventional wisdom that greed scales with opportunity turned out to be wrong. What scaled, it seemed, was the discomfort of seeing yourself as a thief. The bigger the sum, the harder it became to keep without becoming, in your own eyes, a person you did not want to be. Maren had never read the study. She didn't need to. She was living the experiment from the inside, and the discomfort the researchers measured in their data was the thing keeping her awake at 3 a.m, staring at a water stain on her bedroom ceiling, and arguing with a dead man. On the 5th day she called Desmond Achterberg. He did not believe her at first. The narrator finds this detail important. When Maren told him, over the phone, that the trunk he had sold her contained a hidden compartment, and that the compartment contained a substantial amount of old currency and gold, Desmond Achterberg's first response was a long silence, and then a single flat question. "What do you want?" He thought it was a con. Of course he did. A woman buys a trunk for $400 and calls a week later claiming it's stuffed with treasure. What was that, if not the opening move of some scheme? He was a careful man, a man who trimmed his mustache with a ruler, and careful men have learned to distrust good news that arrives unsolicited. "I don't want anything," Maren said. "It's not mine. I'm telling you because it isn't mine and you should have it." "You bought the trunk." "I bought a trunk. I didn't buy your family's money. There's a difference, and I think you know there's a difference. Or you wouldn't have asked me what I wanted." There was another silence, longer than the first. "My grandmother," Desmond Achterberg said finally, and his voice had changed, had lost the executor's flatness and found something underneath it. "My grandmother came over from England after the First War. She never trusted a bank a day in her life. My mother used to say the old woman had money sewn into the mattresses, and we all laughed. Because that's the kind of thing you say about a stubborn old immigrant who counted her change twice. We laughed about it at her funeral." He stopped. "I'll drive down. I'll be there Thursday." He brought his daughter, a woman named Tessa Achterberg Lund, who was about Maren's age, and who did most of the talking because her father, it became clear within the first 10 minutes, had been undone by the contents of that trunk in a way he could not entirely manage in front of a stranger. They counted it together at the long farmhouse table that Maren had been trying to sell since October. The old bills, the gold sovereigns, all of it laid out under the shop's fluorescent lights. Tessa Achterberg Lund took photographs. She had brought a man with her too, an appraiser from a firm in Toronto, a quiet fellow named Olufemi who handled the bills with cotton gloves and made small involuntary noises of professional delight. The narrator can now give you the number, because by the end of that afternoon there was a number, and it was not the 50,000 Maren had guessed at 3 in the morning. The collector value of the large format notes, several of which were in remarkable condition and one of which, a 1923 specimen, was rare enough that Olufemi photographed it 3 times, and then sat down, came to considerably more. The full appraisal, completed weeks later, would value the find at $141,000. Maren had been 3 months behind on a $4,200 rent. She had held for 5 days in a trunk on the floor of her father's shop the better part of $140,000 that no one in the world knew existed, and she had picked up the phone. Now. The narrator could end the story there, and many versions of this story do end there, with the good deed glowing like a coal, and the reader warmed by it and sent on their way. But that ending would be a lie of omission, because the right thing did not solve Maren Holloway's problems. It is December still, as far as the plot is concerned, and the rent is still due, and Priya's tuition is still unpaid, and $140,000 has just walked out of the shop in a locked aluminum case in the custody of a Toronto appraiser, and Maren has not asked for a cent of it. She did not ask. The narrator wants that understood clearly. When Tessa Achterberg Lund, at the door, said carefully that the family would of course want to do something to recognize Maren's honesty, Maren told her that wasn't necessary, that returning it wasn't a service she'd performed. It was just the money's actual owner getting the money, and you don't tip a person for handing back what was never theirs. She said it a little too sharply, the way proud people say true things, and Tessa Achterberg Lund looked at her for a moment with an expression Maren couldn't read, and then they were gone, and Maren was alone in the shop with the snow and the $416 in the business account, and a problem that honesty had not fixed. She went home. She finally opened the kitchen drawer with the tuition letters in it. She made tea she didn't drink. And the next morning, she did the thing she had been refusing to do for 2 years. She called the developer's office and left a message saying that if the offer on the building still stood, she was prepared to talk. It was, the narrator thinks, the saddest moment in the whole of it. Not the temptation, not the sleepless nights, this. The morning a woman who had done the hardest right thing of her life picked up the phone to surrender the one thing she'd been fighting to keep, because doing right had emptied her pockets and the bills did not care about her character. The developer's office did not call back that day. As it happened, they never got the chance. What Maren did not know, what she could not have known, was what Desmond Achterberg did on the drive back to Wawa. He was, the narrator has mentioned, a careful man. Careful men keep records, and careful men keep promises, and careful men, it turns out, are sometimes capable of a generosity that careless men never manage, precisely because they think a thing through before they do it. Somewhere on Highway 17, north of Batchawana Bay, with his sister's recovered fortune in a case in the trunk and his daughter driving, Desmond Achterberg did some arithmetic of his own. He found out, because he was the kind of man who could find things out, exactly what shape Maren Holloway's business was in. It is not hard, in a small city, to learn that a shop is 3 months behind on its rent. He learned about the back taxes. He learned, through a contact at the college whose name the narrator will keep out of this, that there was a nursing student named Priya Holloway with a tuition hold on her account. He assembled, in other words, the same picture the narrator gave you at the start of this story, the full and humiliating ledger of Maren's circumstances. And he understood, looking at it, exactly what she had turned down. A person 3 months behind on the rent had found $140,000 and given it back. Not because she was rich, because she was the daughter of a man who drove 60 kilometers to refund $80. The narrator will not pretend to know everything that passed between Desmond Achterberg and his daughter on that drive. But the narrator knows what they did, because it is a matter of record, and here it is. 3 things happened in January. The first was that the back rent disappeared. Maren got a call from her landlord, a tired man named Patterson who had been carrying her for 3 months, while making it very clear he could not carry her for a 4th, and Patterson told her in a baffled voice that her account had been brought current, all 3 months. Plus, the next 6, paid in advance. He had assumed it was her doing and was calling to confirm the lease terms. It was not her doing. Maren stood in the shop with the phone against her ear and did not have the first idea what to say. The second was a courier envelope, heavy stock, with a Wawa return address. Inside was a check made out to Priya Holloway, in an amount that covered her outstanding tuition and the next 2 years besides, and a short note in a careful hand that read only, "For the nurse. From a family who knows what it is to come over with nothing. Tell her to take care of people. D.A." The third happened on a Saturday, when Desmond Achterberg's camel coat appeared once again at the front of the shop, snow on the shoulders, and the man himself, ruler straight, asked Maren if she would sit down with him because he had a proposal, and he did not intend to take no for an answer. The proposal was this. The Achterberg family, which the narrator can now tell you was a great deal more substantial than a camel coat had let on, old timber money out of the Algoma district, the kind of quiet northern Ontario wealth that does not announce itself, wished to establish, in memory of the grandmother whose distrust of banks had just made everyone considerably richer, a fund. The fund's purpose would be the preservation and restoration of regional heritage furniture, the cataloging of estate pieces across the North, the kind of patient, unglamorous, money-losing work that no one else would pay for because there was no money in it. and they wanted Marin Holloway to run it. A salary, a real one. The first real salary she'd seen in 2 years. An operating budget. The shop on Spadina to serve as its workshop and showroom, the lease now permanently in the foundation's name, which meant the words Holloway and Daughter would stay painted on that front window for as long as Marin wanted them there and longer. "I'm not a charity," Marin said, because of course she did. Proud people say true things at the wrong moments. The narrator has noted this already. "No," Desmond Achterberg agreed. "You're an asset. There's a difference, and I think you know there's a difference." He had remembered her own words and handed them back to her, and Marin understood, in that moment, that he had thought this through the way he thought everything through, that this was not pity, that a man who trimmed his mustache with a ruler did not do anything by accident. "My grandmother sewed a fortune into a trunk because she did not trust the world to be honest with her. You proved her wrong. I would like to fund the kind of work that proves her wrong every day. I can't think of anyone I'd rather have do it." Marin Holloway, who had not cried when the bakery failed before this, and had not cried at her father's funeral, and had not cried on any of the 5 nights she sat up arguing with a dead man over a trunk full of money, put her face in her hands at the long farmhouse table she had been trying to sell since October, and wept. The shop is still there. The narrator drove past it last spring, and the window still reads Holloway and Daughter in her father's hand lettering, freshened now with a coat of paint, and below it a smaller line that wasn't there before. A heritage workshop of the Achterberg Foundation. There is a steamer trunk in the front window, restored, brass corners polished back to gold. It is not the trunk that one went to a museum in Sault Ste. Marie, where its false bottom is displayed open beside a placard that tells the story in 2 careful paragraphs. The trunk in the window is just a good example of the type, but Marin put it there on purpose, and anyone who knows the story understands why. Priya is a registered nurse now. She works the night shift at Sault Area Hospital, and she is, by every account, the kind of nurse who stays past the end of her shift to sit with the patients who don't have anyone, which is the part the narrator suspects Desmond Achterberg's grandmother would have liked best of all. And Marin. Marin spends her days exactly as she spent them before, with her hands in the work, reading dovetails and refinishing other people's heirlooms, except that now the work pays, and now the work matters to someone with the money to keep it alive. She did not get rich. The narrator wants to be precise about that, because the easy version of this story makes her rich, and the easy version is not true. She got something more durable than rich. She got to keep being who she was, in the place she was from, doing the thing her father taught her, without the cold thumb of January pressing on the window. The narrator has been turning this story over for a while now, and here at the end is the part to say directly to you, because it is the part that matters. It is tempting to read all this as a transaction. Marin did a good thing, and a good thing came back to her, and the universe balanced its books. But that reading gets it exactly backwards, and the narrator does not want you to leave with it. The truth is harder and better. When Marin Holloway picked up the phone and called Desmond Achterberg, she did not know there would be a foundation. She did not know there would be a check for her daughter or 6 months of rent or a salary. She fully expected, in fact, to lose the shop. She had her hand on the phone to call the developer the very next morning. She gave back $140,000, believing it would ruin her, and she gave it back anyway. That is the whole of it. That is what her father meant, all those years, about what you do when no one is watching. The reward is not the point, and never was. The reward, when it comes, is a gift and a surprise, and entirely beside the point, because the kind of person who does the right thing only when a reward is guaranteed is not, in the end, a person who does the right thing at all. They're just a person making a bet. Marin wasn't betting. She'd done the math, and the math said keep it, and she gave it back anyway. And that, not the foundation, not the window, not the happy ending the narrator has just spent so long describing, that is the thing worth remembering about her. So the next time you find yourself holding something that isn't yours, in a moment when no one would ever know, and you will, everyone does, eventually. The narrator hopes you remember a furniture maker in Sault Ste. Marie who was 3 months behind on her rent and gave back a fortune because her father taught her that the trade only works because of what you do when nobody's looking. The reward may come. Do the thing anyway. That's where the whole of a person lives, in the part nobody sees. I keep coming back to that floor. Marin sitting cross-legged on the cold boards of her father's shop, $140,000 in her lap, 3 months behind on the rent, and nobody in the world who would ever have known. That's the image that stays with me, because that's the moment the whole thing was decided. Not later, not when the check came, but right there alone, with the snow ticking on the glass. I've thought a lot about why she gave it back, and I don't think it was a single grand decision. I think it was 30 years of small ones. Her father refunding $80 to a man who'd never have noticed the veneer. Marin learning, without anyone announcing it, that the work only holds together because of what you do when no one's watching. Character isn't a thing you summon in the big moment. It's a thing you've already built quietly, in 100 moments nobody ever saw, so that when the test finally comes you don't have to decide who you are, you already know. And here's the part I won't let myself forget. Doing the right thing did not save her. It emptied her out. She had her hand on the phone to sell the shop the very next morning. So when I tell you to be the kind of person who returns the trunk, I'm not promising you a foundation and a salary and your name kept on the window. Marin didn't have those promises either. She gave it back believing it would ruin her, and that's exactly what makes it count. What did save her, in the end, was that she'd built 3 things over a lifetime without ever calling them by name. She'd built a spine, the stubbornness that kept the lights on for 2 years past when the numbers said quit. The same stubbornness that made her drive 2 hours through December snow for a trunk. She'd built a clear head. She could read a dovetail, price a room, tell oak from ash by the smell, and she did the cold math on that money and understood precisely what she was walking away from. And she'd built a conscience that the other 2 had to answer to. The grit got her to the trunk. The smarts told her what it was worth. The conscience told her it wasn't hers. You need all 3. Grit without conscience is just a thief who works hard. Conscience without grit folds the first cold morning. Marin had all 3, and that's why the story ends the way it does. So I'll leave you where I started, on that floor. The next time life hands you something that isn't yours, in a moment when no one would ever know, and it will, it happens to everyone eventually. I hope you remember a tired woman in Sault Ste. Marie who picked up the phone. The reward might come. It usually doesn't. Do the thing anyway. That's where the whole of a person lives. In the part nobody sees.